this may be below the level I should be targeting at. I was really hoping to just spawn more discussion with mine, since this is supposed to be a summit, and it's not nearly going to be the brain work of the previous discussion. Let's see if I can get it started. Okay, I'm Tom Highfield. I'm supposed to be doing creating and managing professional installations. This is a smaller subject than you might imagine, because you guys cover a whole bunch of this stuff in various discussions along the way today. For what it's worth, I'm retired, so I don't have a job. That means this probably should have been better than it is. But I don't have a job right now. I'm just playing around with embedded stuff and looking to maybe expand myself into the embedded market sometime later. So, what's a professional installation? To me, all that is the user runs one program to install his software. That's all. And when he starts it up, it doesn't flood him with errors. That's the real gist of it. I'll go through some of my notes. I'll specify I'm really addressing installation of compiled code. I'll talk about the standard environment, but I expect everything to be compiled when you're deploying something. Normally, say a part of a shift to production on your DUT, something along those lines. Although I've used it in the engineering environment just to save license fees. And the last company I worked for did most of their engineering in Taiwan while I was here. And so I fed them software as well, and that had to be very carefully compiled and deployed. The guys in Taiwan didn't read English very well. The guys in Taiwan would have to call me at 11 o'clock at night to get help. They needed to run one program to set it up, and they needed to run into no errors when they ran it. Now, you guys have covered most of that kind of stuff in the code review discussions today. So, let's see here. Where am I at? Now I'm hitting a button. Again. Setup or a single executable zip file. I'll toss in WinZip here every now and then. I know it's not a LabVIEW or a National Instruments product, but the fact is, if you're doing installations, it's real handy, and there's just no way around it. Matter of fact, spend the money for the real WinZip, spend the money for their self-extractor. Totals to less than $100, it'll earn itself in a couple of days if you're doing deployments. I mentioned no surprises. No permission errors. I'll back up. Some of these you can solve in the actual installation, in the application builder and in the installer, when you have individual files you can mention if they're going to be locked or not. And if anybody has any questions, by the way, related to the application builder, I've kind of got one on another screen I can bring up real quick. So just toss the question out. But permission errors are one of those things that drive a user insane. Really, your installation, that one program he runs to install it, and when he starts to run it, if he runs into errors, you've lost his attention, or her attention. You've lost the user's attention. They're already unhappy. Learning to run your actual software is going to be that much harder for them. So a lot of this is, more than anything else, I want to say psychological. You're trying to hold on to the user. I mentioned here, user's first impression. It's extremely important to engage the confidence of the user at the beginning, and I'd already mentioned it'll be much more difficult to retain their enthusiasm when they're trying to learn the software. Sooner or later you do have to deploy it. If you start getting calls back, they're going to get in the way. Not only are your users unhappy, but you're off your schedule. Odds are pretty good you didn't plan to have every user call you up, come up with a different problem, which you're now shuffling because you've got, let's say in this case, 3 users all really bummed out and all calling you wondering why things don't work. Who do you fix first? Well, one of them's your boss, you fix his first. But other than that, it's hard to decide what to do. So you really, again, testing up front, code reviews up front, everything to avoid an error when the user installs. Another mention, if you ever want to take a vacation, somebody else may have to do this installation for you. So again, a single file setup or maybe you want to say a link in an email. Perfectly good way to keep this thing going. I've run into the situation where English wasn't their native language. That goes two ways. I've had to log into a computer in Taiwan and try to figure out what the heck the Chinese on the screen meant. Fortunately, Windows is kind enough to put the little, say if you're trying to do a right-click copy, there'll be a Chinese symbol, but there'll still be a C in parentheses after it. So fortunately, you can usually figure that sort of thing out. And plus, you have other teammates that are probably going to assume your maintenance duties at some point, or may have to cover you while you're on vacation. Now, the available tools you have for this sort of thing, I mentioned the application builder and WinZip. The app builder does a zillion things. I want to say it's only in the most extreme cases that I found an absolute need to have some sort of zip program. And I want to say a professional zip program, because LabVIEW is capable of building a zip file. And I'll mention that later, and I put it to use.
Are you going to talk about that update build spec?
Run that by me again?
Are you going to speak more about that update build spec?
Oh, you mean this one?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
And by the way, that's wrong buttons. That is the example I happen to have sitting on another screen. There isn't very much to it, but it does include a couple of additional installers and things you can play with. So if somebody wants to see what's going on with my project, it's very simple and I can bring it up. I mentioned controlling the target operating environment you're dealing with and what's useful about that. It seems as though everybody in here goes for the compiled code and distributing something that way. If you have a finished application and you expect it to run on uncompiled desktop, odds are pretty good somewhere down the line that version's going to change. That LabVIEW version is going to change. Or you're going to start working on a new project with a newer version of LabVIEW and want to put it back on the old machine. I don't know. Keeping the development environment as your operating version does nothing to cause problems down the line. If you go ahead and compile things, you get that runtime library that gets installed out there. You can have 5 runtime libraries on one machine. You can have 5 programs running different runtime libraries at one time on one machine. They don't get in each other's way. So sticking to the compiled thing makes that program so much more independent. I'll mention one of the biggest advantages, of course, for that standard environment is how easy debugging is. And that's not only just for your code, that's for the device under test. I'll venture a guess that a lot of your engineering stations have LabVIEW installed on them, and you use raw code there because you can dig into the code to try to figure out what's going on with the device under test. But, and of course, code changes are so much easier if it's not compiled. But the drawbacks are that expensive license, the restriction to that installed version, and upgrades may start breaking things. Required drivers also may be a mystery if you need to deploy this later and you've never compiled it. There's a good chance you're not quite sure what's really in there. The good news is the installer has changed in either the last version or the version before that, 12 or 13, where it does a much better job of detecting the necessary drivers in that additional installer section. It used to miss quite a few of them, but now it seems to detect them all and put them in quite effectively. On the runtime environment, great advantage, no charge for that license, unless you're one of the test stand guys. Yeah. But I think they've reduced the license fees there as well. I don't know. They've changed it. There's a different license structure, if I remember right, for test stand. The executable license is quite a bit cheaper than it used to be, and maybe a one-shot deal. I don't think you have to pay to upgrade it anymore.
Right.
Yeah. Another great advantage is you create the best archive point you could possibly have for that software. I know source control is a wonderful thing, but if you want to rebuild a revision from 5 deployed versions ago, it's hard to do with source control, especially if you change runtime versions or if some of those libraries change, because odds are pretty good you're not protecting those in source control. But you can take the entire installation, zip it up, and toss it off on a disk and bring it back almost any time later and reinstall it. And you can expect it to work. And I mentioned earlier that the machine can be shared with software running other versions. Some of the drawbacks, you're responsible for all that error handling. Your error handling has to be much, much better than it used to be. Both bringing the errors out to the user or bringing errors out to yourself. And I'm going to say you'll probably add a whole bunch more log files if you're running something to deployed at a remote location so that you can figure out how they got there, what happened when they got there. And I mentioned that troubleshooting is definitely more difficult. I don't know if anybody here has done any of the remote debugging where you do a remote trace.
Yeah, I've tried that, and one of the drawbacks is that for our application, it takes a long time to initialize the session because it's downloading the state of every VI to your computer. And it's,
That's right. And if it's a very big application, there's a perfectly good chance any small error any place will cause that remote debug to kind of break. On the other hand, if you're stuck, it's real handy. If you're stuck, it's very handy. We'll go into installing components correctly. This is another thing that's a code review kind of issue. You have a lot of stuff that's created by the builder or the installer. Builder includes extra files, the installer can include extra installers. And they'll pretty much take care of any root directory issues that you have. Any execution or data or driver roots are going to be properly handled. Script and data roots, not so much. Those are things you're going to build yourselves. If you do need a directory created with the installer, it's not that big a deal to toss a seed file out someplace in your build so that it turns around and creates a directory when it gets installed. And that's the same kind of thing you might do with WinZip. Put a seed file someplace so that it causes a directory to get created. But what counts is that the operator doesn't run part of his program and have it come up and say, gee, I can't figure out where to store this file because I have a bad directory path. All of this code review kind of things. Certain things are, the automatic configuration is kind of a nice affair. This is where I'll bring up an option that other folks may have looked for. So you have a program named .ini and it gets dropped out there. Is there any way to change that installer so that that doesn't inherently get replaced every time you reinstall? And that's a good question for the LabVIEW folks. Just about every file in the installer, you can lock them, you can unlock them, you can do a lot of things as to whether they're hidden or private. But one thing you can't do is avoid an automatic override.
Sure you can. You just have to make program name .ini so it's read-only. It won't overwrite.
If it's read-only, then the operator can't write to it.
Actually, you can have your software.
Yeah, that's true. You can have your software on
and
the
then
fly
you
go out
write
and
to
change
it and then
it.
change it back.
Yeah.
And if it's the other thing I do though most of the time is anything that's writing to it, I don't put it in that. I have my own
Well, and
elsewhere.
next slide. I
runs
was
first time.
going to say the next slide is going to be, or the slide after this maybe. I'll bring that up somewhere later, but I suggest using something other than the internal or the automatic ini file for any important configuration stuff that you don't want to replace when you do a reinstall. Driver files, by the way, handled quite well by the installer. You just don't have to worry about it. VIs called by reference, that's another interesting problem. If you call them by reference using that static VI reference, fine, they get included automatically. If you don't, and you have to remember to put them in the always included section on the builder. Any kind of testing, you'll find that out right away because it won't be able to find that VI. But that's very important. You have to pay attention to that and make sure that does get installed. Now, on the as required thing that he had just brought up, I honestly suggest any configuration files you don't want overwritten or want to preserve, I'll say user or device under test setup information from one operation to the next, put them in some other directory. Don't have them as part of the standard install. Configuration files are very good for this because it's easy to have default inputs on a configuration file. They're very easy to work with. And then things like data files, cal files, you also want to put them someplace where you just never override them. Again, if you use a sample file just to cause a directory to get built, that's not going to overwrite necessarily a cal or a data file. Another thing about testing, if you haven't already stumbled over this, make darn sure you have some kind of sandbox computer someplace in your cube, in your lab, somewhere, a computer that IT has given you everything you need to rebuild that baby from scratch. You can quickly go out and erase everything National Instruments from it anyway to make sure it's a fresh computer and use that for testing before you go anywhere near an operator. And for that matter, you may have to retain some hardware too. I've run into that problem. We had to retain a certain amount of interface hardware in the computer and save it for somewhere down the road. Or a year from now, you have to do an update. Yes?
Anybody in here use virtual machines for this kind of thing?
It's fine if you don't.
It locks down all kinds of these like unhandled things that you've just got floating around on your C drive or miscellaneous drivers. And it's all in software on a virtual disk. So if you lose your hardware, you know, that machine that I had that supported the program from '82 died. You can still bring it back as long as you develop, or you've got a build virtual machine and a development virtual machine.
Ghost would also work. You just ghost your installation of Windows.
Right.
And just drop that ghost back on with nothing in there.
And I'll admit that I'm not that computer savvy, and I don't trust my IT people to do that properly for me. And so a fresh computer is the thing I'm always the most comfortable with.
Is anybody using VMs for production test or
Actually running your production code
from a
within
VM?
I'm just curious because we thought about it and we're like, I don't know, that sounds a little scary.
You might have speed issues with that too.
What's that?
You might have speed issues with that.
Yeah. Just curious.
Anything else?
Yeah, exactly.
Also, for field testing, I'm going to pretty comfortably say all of our customers qualify as beta testers. I mean, you're the alpha tester, or you or your peers might be alpha testers, might be out there looking for the big problems. But there's a good chance none of us have a large enough customer base to say we have anything other than a beta test team out there. Which means everybody you hand the software to is going to be able to call you back. It goes back to that first slide. If you dump software out there and the first thing it does is come up with a permission or directory error, and you've given it to 5 people, you got 5 phone calls coming your way automatically. I'm going to break down the full and update installation, at least the way I view it, and I tie it very closely to the versioning, so I'll go through versioning first. I'll pretty much follow the LabVIEW or the National Instruments names. They call the first digit on their versioning when you're doing a build. I'm not talking about the installer version, but the actual build versions. The major one I use for just LabVIEW version changes or big compatibility issues. That means is my software incompatible possibly with an earlier version of my software. That's kind of what I'm getting at on the compatibility issue. I'm going to say part of that is I expect that first digit to almost never change, if it changes at all. It really shouldn't change much.
Why doesn't it change every 6 months or a year?
Well, I'm going to get into that, and you're talking about the LabVIEW version, which in the next slide, I mentioned significant feature addition or changes in additional installers for the next digit, but I think there's a strong case to drag the runtime library change right down to that same level, because it just works too well. It rarely causes a problem. It's really no different than driver changes in a lot of ways, and I guess I've never encountered an issue with it. If I encounter an issue upgrading LabVIEW, I encounter it at the development stage, but not at the runtime stage. So take version 8 software loaded into the development version on 9, that's where I'll start encountering my problems. I don't think I've ever run into anything when I compiled that finished 9. That makes sense? Let's see, next guy down there, the fix layer, and bug fixes, simple features, bug fixes. I'm going to say no changes to the additional installers. We'll kind of get into that a little bit later, but the way I look at it, I don't want to see that additional installer list or the runtime library change at that point. And down at the bottom, the build, that's just practice. You might have 50 builds for one bug fix if you have a really, really hard time fixing the bug. But the fact is, that's the only digit that LabVIEW will automatically increment when they're doing the build. And it's really something, even when you get to Windows, there's a good chance you'll never see that digit again. Once you leave, once you deploy, you'll probably never see that digit again. Now here's where I'll break down the full and update. I expect those first 2 digits to be a full installation because they require additional installers, one sort or another. And that can make for a huge file. I think my last job, I had basically a 2 gigabyte, nearly 2 gigabyte file that if I had to do a full update, I had to get that 2 gigabytes to Taiwan. I can tell you, it took a long time. It was faster to FedEx it than it was to transfer electronics. Or on the other hand, the update, if you have no additional installers required, then you don't have to include them in the build. You don't have to include them in the deployment. You can turn around and actually turn all those additional installers off. Now at this point, it's important to keep track of the fact that if that second digit changes, you need to make sure you do a full install, and you may well have to follow it up with an update because you changed the third digit. So there could be 2 installs involved in putting together a system somewhere once you've started doing updates down the road, once your software's gone through a few changes. A little hard to do that with one file, but with WinZip you can. You can go ahead and execute both installs out of a professional, the WinZip professional self-extractor. Let's see, I'll mention the full install. Created using the installer, the standard national installer, which is really great. I don't think I've ever encountered anything important that it missed, especially since the last 2 versions where they started remembering all the drivers. We did a good chance of picking out all the drivers. But it gets your executables, runtime libraries, drivers. You can even include the hardware configuration file from Macs. That can be a little more difficult to deal with, but it's possible. On the other hand, when you're doing an update, you can do them much smaller than a full installation. You can also use the installer. You go in, turn off all the additional installers, and essentially put in just the executables and the always included files. On the back away from this, if I can, figure out how to do my 2 screens here. Get a directory over there to the home directory, sorry. When I did just a build on my funny little project, 512K. Actually pretty big, I'm surprised it's that big. When I did a full install for that same project, because it included both the runtime library and in this case a DAC MX library, 385 megabytes. Big difference. If you're dealing with someplace remote, you probably don't want to send that whole 385 megabytes across every time you do some kind of bug fix. You're going to want to do just a quick little update before you do any testing, and that's where you can turn around, use the update installer. In this case, this guy came up with about 5 megabytes. He was built, and he has all his additional installers turned off. So the runtime library and the DAC MX library are turned off, they're not being installed. For what it's worth, if you use WinZip and just go after the original build, the pieces that changed, these 3 in this case, you can essentially have an update that's right back to that 500K. So if by chance you're debugging at a remote location, transfer just the executables across, and that's what I consider an update installation. Let's see if I can find my way back to
So you're using the build, the application builder in LabVIEW to
Yes.
exclude or include different drivers. Is that what you're talking about?
Yep.
Okay.
This installer knows I'm running. Someplace somewhere this installer is going to open up. I think I double click it. Yeah. Is it built into the power outlet here that all our computers slow down? Well, I was going to open this up and show you that it had selected 2 installers. Interesting.
Is that the only difference between the two, is the two check boxes?
2 check boxes, DACMX and the runtime, both unchecked. So that may open at some point. Let's continue and see what happens. Okay, and we're like I said, short show. I'm down to my last slide, really. Aside from the fact that, gee, we created our software and we built an installation and we did a full or an update install, it's worth keeping around in mind, and this has come up earlier in the day, that at some point you're going to make some bug fixes, turn around and have to recreate everything. Find a way to automate that work. It's come up in quite a few places around here where people have come up with utilities to speed things up. I knew I used LabVIEW to build zip files for my updates. I had a LabVIEW program that would read a spreadsheet that had a list of all the files I needed if I was doing an update install, and I could just go run that LabVIEW program and make sure the update install had all the proper files built into it. I will admit that I had to load the professional WinZip utility up to turn that into a self-executing file. There was no way to get LabVIEW to do that. Another thing that would be really, really neat with the zip utilities that LabVIEW has, if we could add a self-execution option and the destination root directory.
That would be nice.
Those two things would be handy. Although, and to be honest, that's it. I said it would be not much, so.
So if you're just generating a new executable, how do you distribute that to your users?
With just an executable,
Yeah, like if you're just doing a bug fix where you're generating.
I tend to hand them a self-extracting zip file and say, run this.
Okay.
And I made sure to send all those files to the proper directory. Now, the LabVIEW zip utility expects a from and to directory for each individual file, which was kind of a pain in the beginning, but then turned out to be a real advantage once I figured out how useful it was.
Have you done any work with like a front-end loader that'll check a network or internet location for updates
For
to
an
the software?
update, no, but
And then
to be
update
honest,
it?
it wouldn't be that hard.
Yeah.
Really, all you have to do is pick out your own version, which you can do, and then go off to some location that has a copy of whatever the newer version is. I will say that I don't know that there's a way within LabVIEW to check the version of a remote executable file, an exe file sitting someplace else. I don't know offhand if you can do that, but I think you
Isn't
can.
there a preset?
Pardon?
I haven't
There
put the
is-
installer, but there should be, is there, just like with the EXEs? can
Oh,
you
well, now if you're just
separate-
running the
yeah.
installer
Yeah.
will figure out the versions and whether or not you
Yeah.
need to update pieces without any trouble at all.
They announced some sort of software at NIE.
I was gonna ask, who's using deploy?
Executable on the hard drive?
I think so. If you want to do a Windows call.
I'm telling you it is, because that's how
What's
we
that?
do our flash screens.
Okay.
We actually look up the
Said deploy
Windows.
what?
Yeah.
You like, it's a
So
software.
that would mean only all.
I'll wait till they're done.
And display it for the user. So I'm certain you can go onto a network drive and do the same thing and
Yeah.
compare them. It's not that
And
big
just
a
take a
deal.
look at a file and see what the version is out there.
Yeah, it's not a big deal.
That'd just be something you
.NET
built in
also
your
has-
software. I think you had mentioned you built it into yours.
Yeah, for on, actually, the guys here built something that I
Yeah, it
implemented.
doesn't really, that's the sort of thing I don't think is all that terribly difficult. I found automatic updates did nothing but tick off the engineers. They hate having things change underneath them. You got some guy who's banging away at his bench, and admittedly, I probably work more engineering labs than production lines. But yeah, you have some guy banging away at his bench trying to solve a problem, and it doesn't matter what you're changing on his test software, he doesn't want to see
It's
it.
the principle of the thing.
So you have to, again, that's part of the psychology of this thing. Don't stick something new out there that's gonna break, because then you'll never talk that engineering upgrade.
Right.
Yeah.
Make sure everything works before you get it out there. You really need the confidence of your users, or you'll spend all your time away from your desk in the lab.
In Fabiola's 5 Little Things, or Little Things presentation, she showed a sub-VI that did report the version of an executable.
I know you
I
can't
don't
do in
know.
LabVIEW, and I'm pretty comfortable with what he said. There's a way to go out in Windows, look at a
I
file,
have
and
it.
find out what its version is.
I had a question from a while back. You said you talked about separating the config files, those that are writable and those that are not. And I'm just to the community. I have a question about how many of you are kind of diligent about structuring your software so that the stuff that goes into program files or wherever your destination installation folder is read only, and everything that's writable is somewhere else. So they should never have to go into the program files. Anybody follow that?
Yes, true.
Yeah.
Most people?
We have like an executable folder and then like a data files folder separate.
I like the other point that you brought up in terms of, it kind of relates back to something that was said at the CLA was, you said, hey, if personal preference folder or file isn't there, I check it, if it's not there, I use defaults. That way, at least you don't get that error of saying, I don't see how to configure this thing. That was one of Fabiola's points when she was talking about configuration files, was, and this it ties directly into what you were saying, Tom, was this idea of don't have them come up with any error because the file's not there. Put reasonable default values in it and allow it to use.
Yeah, and most users are gonna change those defaults right away.
Right.
And then when you exit, it saves it off, and then it's done, it's fine.
Yeah.
Agreed.
What was that VI that you threw down there?
What, the one I just tossed in?
Yeah.
Erased?
Yeah, which one?
Your file constants, get system directory.
They're all right in
I
there.
never noticed that.
And it
That was
snuck
added about
in
the same
recently,
time
when did that
as-
sneak in?
Wasn't that added about the same time as
Few
this guy
versions,
down here,
Yeah,
application
but I think I
directory?
had one that I
Yeah.
wrote.
Which allowed you to use this VI, both executables and standard code without having to freak out. Yeah. Because I remember you used to have to write a special VI to tell if you were in an executable.
Yep.
Yeah. Any other questions? I told you this would be easier.
I had that one last question. Who knows, who's using deploy? Who knows what deploy is?
Oh, the add-on?
Yeah.
Kind of.
I use deploy for embedded.
For embedded?
Yeah, this is the one from Wirebird Labs, Jack Thunderway.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So, I haven't dug into it too far yet, but
Deploy puts things on there.
Yeah.
That's pretty good.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of stuff on there.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're not even on the internet, so that's not an issue.
Yeah, because it's an add-on app that make a lot of the stuff.
It's just not-
Okay, sounds like that's it.
Yeah, nicely done.